Happy glorious Friday, everyone. It is time for another episode of the Lions Grid. Today we're introducing our new segment, the Fantasy Football Focus, keeping that alliteration alive for a Friday, so you get your four Fs there. And today we'll be taking a look at a couple different things. We'll kick off today's episode by just recapping some of the latest news we have coming out of the various practices and camps. As we mentioned yesterday, Joe, during our injury and sort of roster moves update episode, Le'Veon Bell did have an MRI. It did reveal no major...
On him, with their starting quarterback being out, the game plan's going to shift from, being game manager throwing the football to hoping that Le'Veon Bell can make some plays.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. With Sam Darnold out and Trevor Siemian in, having Le'Veon Bell there is going to be, I think, important for that Jets offense success. So it'll be interesting there. Other news around the league: Dolphins defensive back Minkah Fitzpatrick. He was drafted out of Alabama last season. He's gotten permission from the Dolphins to seek a trade. So they are looking to go into full-blown tank mode down there in Miami. Mike Williams, the wide receiver for the Los Angeles Chargers, was unable to practice today. He has a knee issue and looks like he might be doubtful, definitely questionable for Sunday's matchup with the Lions. The Chargers, of course, also without Hunter Henry. So that means that passing attack for the Chargers is really going to lean heavily on Keenan Allen, Dontrell Inman, and Travis Benjamin for the Chargers. So potentially good news for Lions fans. But certainly something to keep an eye on here moving forward. And this will come into play later. But Joe Mixon was reportedly practicing today for the Bengals. He is still questionable for Sunday's game, but someone you're definitely going to want to keep an eye on there to see whether or not he is a full go for the Bengals or not. Antonio Brown, according to Dan Patrick, who reported this on his show earlier today, will not be placed on the commissioner's exempt list, so he should still be active for Week 2. Nothing from the NFL is going to be preventing him from playing, so potentially could see him in action for the first time as a New England Patriot against the Miami Dolphins. Tyler Lockett returned to practice for the Seahawks. Juju Smith-Schuster's been back to practicing in fully for the Steelers, so he should be a go against the Seattle Seahawks. And then last but not least, taking a look over at the New York Giants, their two top receivers, Sterling Shepard and Cody Latimer, both didn't practice on Thursday. You'll have to keep an eye on them to see if they are going to be a go here in Week 2. But certainly that could leave a very depleted Giants offense to lean heavily on Mr. Saquon Barkley and Evan Ingram, which, Joe, for you, since you are a Barkley fantasy football owner, could mean that he sees a little bit of an uptick in his fantasy performance this week.
Yeah, but you got to be able to, throw the ball effectively for a few yards to also help out the run game. If the other team knows you're running it on every play, it's going to be tough to move the ball effectively.
Certainly. They will certainly be loading up the box. So those are sort of the latest updates. And Joe, there are 5 questions I think that are really important headed here into Week 2, especially from a fantasy football perspective. So we'll get your take here on them. The first is, as I mentioned, it's been reported on the Dan Patrick Show that no action is going to be taken by the league against Antonio Brown. But do you think we will actually see him suit up and play for the Patriots this weekend?
The answer to that question is yes. I think Antonio Brown is going to play for the Patriots this weekend. I think he's going to be integrated into the offense. That it being the Patriots, he's not going to be, starting off Randy Moss, number 1 wide receiver on the team, making all the big plays. But I can see him still having a good game and being a go-to target in the game. But I don't look for him to have, number 1 wide receiver in Pittsburgh numbers. I'm looking for him to have a good game, and I'm looking for Tom Brady to target him maybe 10 times with 7 receptions and, maybe 70 yards, maybe a touchdown. But I'm not looking for him to blow up the fantasy football, scoreboard.
Yeah, and of course he is, again, luckily for you, one of your fantasy football players. So if he does go off, I'm not sure if you're going to have him in or not this week, but potentially a little bit of something there for you. But yeah, I think obviously looking at the Patriots, they have a ton of offensive weapons. Julian Edelman, James White, Philip Dorsett, Josh Gordon. There's a lot of mouths to feed there. So it's going to be interesting to see. Number one, we haven't really seen him on the field yet. So it's going to be nice to see him back there, but it is going to be interesting to see how he fits into that Patriots offense, where there are plenty of people who are going to be looking for some quality targets. And I think you're right. He might not get as many targets as he did with the Steelers. So the ones he does receive, it's going to be important that he capitalizes on them, that he makes the most out of those. Next question here for you, Joe. Do you think Baker Mayfield, the Cleveland Browns quarterback, will bounce back here in Week 2 on Monday Night Football against the Jets?
Yeah, I think he's going to have a much better game than he did in Week 1. I think that the Jets' defense is still pretty good, so I don't see him lighting up the scoreboard like the first player that we gave analysis to. But I do see him having a better game than Week 1, and I do see the Cleveland Browns being able to control the game more effectively through their offense. Baker Mayfield will throw the ball. He'll be effective throwing the ball, and he will have a better game, but it's not going to be a light up the scoreboard game. I just think that those games are tough to come by, and I don't think he's going to have one against the Jets. Although he had some standout games last year, I like the Jets' defense too. So, I mean, he's going to have a good game, but we'll have to see how good it is.
Yeah, and the Jets' defense, of course, is struggling with a couple of injuries there. C.J. Mosley, Quentin Williams. It's not really clear. If they play, they're still not going to be at 100% in the game. So that's definitely in his favor. Of course, we already talked about Sam Darnold not being there for the Jets. So potentially a Jets offense that's going 3 and out may keep the ball in Baker's hand more often, which, having that higher time of time of possession will help him out. But we'll have to see what happens there. But both of us chose the Browns to beat the Titans last week, so it was a little bit of a surprise to see them come out and get beat so handedly by the Titans. The big thing is going to be limiting those turnovers because, just last night, we both chose Carolina to take down Tampa Bay. I think largely because in Week 1, Jameis Winston was, he had 3 turnovers himself in that game and looked bad. If Baker Mayfield can come into this game, cut down on those turnovers because he had 3 interceptions against the Titans, if he can come in and limit his turnovers, I think they'll be, he's instantly going to have a better game. Jameis Winston didn't light the world on fire last night, but he didn't turn the ball over, and it made a difference for that team in terms of getting their first win. So from a fantasy football perspective, I think it's still a bit risky to go with Baker Mayfield, but I do think him and the Browns are the team with the better chance of getting back on track here, considering everything that's going on with the Jets.
Yeah, one thing about Baker Mayfield is it's his sophomore year in the NFL, and we've seen a lot of rookies come into the league and have great rookie seasons, go into their second year, hit that sophomore slump, or don't perform as well as their first season, and after Week 1, it gives us reason to put a question mark on Baker Mayfield and his consistency, not only that he had in year 1 as a good player, but is he going to be consistently a good NFL quarterback, or is he going to have a couple good years, a couple bad years? We're not talking about years. We're talking about week to week. Mm-hmm. So what we have to see is, is he going to get back to that good quarterback that we saw make plays in year 1?
Yep, I think it's going to be – he's got to rebound quickly because you're right. He doesn't have a whole nother year now to wait to take a step forward. He's got to get back on track here quickly if the Browns want to have a chance of making the playoffs this year. Speaking of playoff teams, obviously the Chiefs, we both consider them to be one of the best teams in the NFL. In Week 1, they did put up 40 points, and they did it without Tyreek Hill. The question, Joe, is do you think the offense can continue to perform at the level it did in Week 1 without Tyreek Hill moving forward? Sammy Watkins, of course, had his best fantasy performance of his entire career in Week 1. You had LaShawn McCoy coming back to life. Of course, you still have Travis Kelce, Damian Williams. There are plenty of talent still on that Chiefs offense. But do you think they can keep that pace up from Week 1, or do you think missing Tyreek Hill is going to sort of slow that offense down from the pace that we've grown accustomed to?
I think one thing we've always seen with Andy Reid's offense, even when he was in Philadelphia, was that he's always able to calibrate a game plan that's going to put up points. And he put up a lot of points with Kansas City last week against Jacksonville, against a defense that was ranked one of the better defenses, in the league, above the bottom 16. So I think that Kansas City losing a key player, playmaker, is gonna hinder them a little bit. But putting up 41 points against Jacksonville is good. And I think that with Patrick Mahomes being the reigning MVP, I don't see him slowing down. He did get hit hard and he did have a limp after Week 1, but I don't think they're going to really, downgrade in the point production. One thing to watch, though, is if the defense can play well, because that'll equate to more points for the offense. Defense, offense is their strong suit. So, no, I don't think they're going to lack in production. Somebody's going to come in and fill the role and be successful.
Speaking of needing to fill the role, we already talked about the Browns there with the Baker Mayfield question, but when we were choosing our picks for the AFC North, we were talking about, the Browns, the Ravens, the Steelers, and there was one AFC North team that we left completely out of that discussion thinking they weren't going to be very good at all, the Cincinnati Bengals. Obviously, they're without their star wide receiver, A.J. Green, but last week, Andy Dalton and the Cincinnati Bengals came out and said they aren't done quite yet. Throwing for over 418 yards, a new career high for Andy Dalton. John Ross stole the show. Grabbing in 158 yards and 2 touchdowns. And then Tyler Boyd also came in and had a pretty good game too. Of course, Joe Mixon was a big part of that too with running the ball. And as I mentioned, it's not clear just yet if he'll be suiting up for this Sunday's game. But Joe, obviously that's, like I said, we didn't have high expectations for the Bengals heading into the season. They came out here Week 1, sort of surprised people. Do you think it was a fluke, or do you think they can keep that mojo flowing through the rest of the season?
I always used to like the Bengals more than the Browns. The Browns are more Hollywood now. They're the more attractive team to watch on television. And, Cincinnati's like, we've seen them in the playoffs. Dalton's been there before. He hasn't gotten the job done. What have they done recently to show any type of improvement? And they come out and put up points in Week 1. I'm still not convinced, and I don't believe in Andy Dalton. Joe Mixon is a good running back. I believe he lacks a supporting cast, though. So I think it was a fluke, and I don't think that they're going to be able to keep up that type of play.
Yeah, and we talked about it a little bit yesterday that I was adding Hunter Henry to my list of fantasy football players to stay away from. Of course, the first person on that list, the only other member, is Andy Dalton. I've been burned too many times, so I'm in that same boat. I'm not going to be buying too heavily into what we saw out of Week 1. I'm not opposed to the Bengals being good. Like, I wouldn't mind if they came out and had a real renaissance of a season and surprised everybody. But, I don't bet on games. But if I were to bet, I would not bet on the Cincinnati Bengals to keep that going, just because I've been hurt too many times. I've tried Andy Dalton in fantasy football. It never works. So, yeah, best of luck to the Bengals, but until they actually win, I can't. I'm not going to say I believe a whole lot in them. Another question of belief, Joe. We were talking about our picks for the power rankings earlier this week. There was a team that you had on the bubble whether or not you wanted them to be in your top 5, and that was the Baltimore Ravens. Obviously, headed into Week 2, one of the things we're going to find out is is Lamar Jackson for real? He had a tremendous week 1. Do you think he can replicate that in week 2 against a Arizona Cardinals team that Matt Stafford and the Lions offense seem to find success against?
When you compare quarterbacks like Kyler Murray versus Lamar Jackson coming off the game that he played in week 1 is going to be feeling it. He's going to have his adrenaline pumping. He's going to want to run the ball, throw the ball, play another good game. And I don't see any reason why that's going to stop. I really don't think Arizona's defense, when it comes to, stopping the pass, is going to do a good job at containing some of the throws by Lamar Jackson, which gives him more, availability to make a few more mistakes than he did in week 1. And I do believe that, Cardinals were really good at stopping the run, but Stafford was not a mobile quarterback, but yet he still made some plays with his legs. So if they're not going to address that issue, I can see that being a big problem for the Cardinals. So I think that, I think Baltimore is going to have another good week. And if they do have a good week against the Cardinals, people are going to stop thinking that Lamar Jackson's just a speed quarterback and got lucky with a few throws. And they're going to start looking at Baltimore as, a playoff team.
Yeah, most certainly a chance here. And, with the Cardinals being their opponent for Sunday, for the Cardinals, I feel sorry because, you have a rookie head coach, rookie quarterback. You started out the season at home, which was nice, but now you're going on the road to Baltimore to face one of the defenses that for years has been one of the, better defenses in the league. That's a tough ask. Obviously, they are undefeated, just like the Lions are currently. But I think it's going to be a tall ask to go into Baltimore, especially if they can, the challenge is already their defense, but if that offense can keep up to that same level, certainly an opportunity for the Ravens to make themselves look like a early favorite there, not only for the AFC North, but as a potential contender there to take that AFC title.
Yeah, not only are the Ravens ranked in the top 8 in most polls and power rankings, Detroit Lions were ranked, 25 or under in most power rankings. So to think that, Arizona just being able to tie them and being one of the worst teams in the league, you got to expect Baltimore to have a good week against Arizona.
Certainly could. So we'll round out the show here by just taking a look at some of the people you should consider starting at the various positions here for fantasy football. And then some of the guys that you might want to consider sitting. So starting at that QB position, Joe, we just talked about him. I think Lamar Jackson is a guy that you should definitely consider having in there. He's led that Baltimore offense to quite the output last week. I don't necessarily know if he can produce always at that same level, but certainly he's going to come out there, and I think he has pretty big upside there. As we've talked about. So I think that's a guy you should take a look at. One of the other guys who is coming off a pretty shaky week 1, I will admit, Matt Ryan with the Falcons. He had a very poor showing against the Vikings, but he's back at home. I think he's had 5 straight games where he's been at home and thrown at least for 2 touchdowns. It is against Philadelphia, so it's going to be difficult. However, it's going to be I think he certainly has a chance to rebound here a little bit because Philadelphia's defense did give up quite a few plays to Case Keenum in Washington in week 1 as well. So they've definitely shown they're vulnerable in the secondary. So I say look at Matt Ryan to go ahead and take advantage of that here in week 2. Another guy to keep a look at, and again, this is mostly based off of the team he's playing, because again, in week 1, didn't necessarily impress. And Joe, I know you haven't been you're not feeling very optimistic about this particular quarterback, but Jared Goff, he's playing the New Orleans Saints. Again, a matchup really that just is favorable just because he can exploit that weak secondary for New Orleans. could be a guy that could have a very good fantasy week. I don't know if that translates to on the field success for the team, but because of how bad the Saints' pass defense is, could be a chance for him to have a big fantasy day.
Jared Goff's overrated. Last week, I think he had 1 touchdown. Not very many offensive points, not very many yards. I don't see him being, a top 10 fantasy quarterback this week or even throughout the season.
We'll see there. And then the guys that I'm thinking are weaker starts, and these are both quarterbacks that are going head to head against each other. I think this week you got to stay away from Kirk Cousins and Aaron Rodgers. Both of those defenses, obviously, the Packers and the Bears had quite the defensive battle to kick off the first week of the NFL season. Aaron Rodgers only threw for 1 touchdown pass, and that was the only touchdown in the game. The Vikings defense is also very good. They were able to capitalize on a lot of mistakes made by the Falcons and convert on turnovers, but otherwise that offense didn't do a whole lot other than score when they should have. So really, if you're looking, I definitely don't think Kirk Cousins and Aaron Rodgers are going to be top 10 quarterbacks this week. Both tough matchups. Joe, what are your thoughts? Do you think either of those two guys might come out and surprise here or dominate their opponent?
Yeah, I think Aaron Rodgers is one of the top 5 quarterbacks, if not top 3 quarterbacks in the league. He showed in week 1 that he can hit multiple receivers, although he doesn't have a lot of talent out there receiving wise. These players make plays. And I think that he can still have a good game and be a productive fantasy quarterback this week or, consistently.
Yeah, most certainly. There's no doubting that Aaron Rodgers is one of the better quarterbacks in the league. So he's usually, if you have him as your fantasy quarterback, unless you have somebody else who has higher upside, typically a start for you. But I think if you do have another option at the quarterback position, like I said, I don't think he's going to come out and be a top 5 fantasy quarterback. I don't see him throwing for, 400 yards and 3 touchdowns. Very talented QB, but I don't know if the fantasy stats are going to be there this week to make him a must start. In fact, I think if it was me, depending on who else I had on the team, I might consider benching him because, again, the Vikings defense, very competent, could be a tough game for fantasy points for Aaron Rodgers.
I got one for you, Kevin. Now, I received 2 trade offers from the same person right after Stafford had his game for Stafford, who threw 3 touchdowns and had 385 yards passing. Should I start Matthew Stafford over Deshaun Watson or keep Deshaun Watson in?
That is a very good question. I would go with Deshaun Watson myself. I think there's kind of 2 thoughts here on how the game against the Chargers could go. Deshaun Watson's playing Jacksonville, and Jacksonville gave up all, Jacksonville should be on paper a very good defense, but they're very dysfunctional for whatever reason when it comes to the actual games. It's not unusual for them to give up a bunch of yards and even give up quite a few points. So I personally, I think Deshaun Watson and the Texans, I'm a little biased. I'm picking them to go to the Super Bowl. I think they're a better team than the Lions. So generally, my rule of thumb when it comes to fantasy football is I'll typically roll the dice on whichever team I think is better, because typically the player that belongs to the better team has a better chance to have a good game. It doesn't mean they'll always have the better game, but it just, it stands to reason the guy on the better team has the better shot.
Now, of those 2 quarterbacks, you said Deshaun Watson was probably a better starter for this week. What would you think about throwing a comparison between Deshaun Watson now and Russell Wilson?
So Russell Wilson is going up against the Steelers, and Russell Wilson is definitely one of those QBs who I think falls in that sort of regular starter position. Like if he's your fantasy football quarterback, I think in most situations, unless you have somebody that has a really good matchup or he's just in a really awful matchup, you have no problem starting Russell Wilson. I think he's, most matchups you're fine to go with him. So and I feel like Deshaun Watson's that same way. Like if they're both, as long as they're not in a really unfavorable matchup, or as long as some big injury doesn't come along, like if DeAndre Hopkins goes down for the season, that might make you think twice about starting Deshaun Watson. But say for an injury or just a really unfortunate matchup, I think both Russell Wilson and Deshaun Watson are in that category of you start them unless there's something that makes you have to sit them. Whereas Stafford's certainly, I think, a pretty good quarterback. And he could have a decent game here against the Chargers. It's kind of hard to tell with him. He's almost like a better version of Andy Dalton in my mind when it comes to fantasy football, because more often than not, he'll have a decent game. But I feel like he usually stays probably somewhere in that 10 to 20 range in terms of your fantasy quarterbacks. Like that's where he's going to be most weeks. He does have the ability to get into that top 10 depending on how he plays or how poorly everyone else plays. But I would say for your average week in fantasy football, Matt Stafford's probably going to be in that 10 to 20 range in terms of his fantasy output. So let's switch it over to the running back position, and let's stick with a Chargers-Detroit theme, and let's talk about Austin Eckler. He's, of course, filling in for Melvin Gordon. He was running the ball, but he was also very good at catching the ball out of the backfield. So I think if you have Austin Eckler, he is a good person to have in there, not only this upcoming week, but just in general. I think he's a good fantasy find if you already had him. And so don't be afraid to play him if you do have him.
Also, I got him.
Yes, you do. So I like how, we were talking before the show, and a lot of the guys we've brought up just happen to be on your team. So it's been, it'll be interesting to see how everything goes. And then I think also, obviously last week Miami got destroyed by Baltimore. So if you're talking about running backs, got to talk about Patriots running backs, and I think Sony Michel could have a big game against Miami. I think James White often makes more plays in the passing game for the Patriots, but Sony Michel can also catch the ball out of the backfield, so I look for him to have a pretty good fantasy day against a Miami Dolphins team that is just bad and doesn't seem like they even want to get better. And then I think a couple guys to watch out for, in my opinion, Aaron Jones, the Packers running back. There was a little bit of a hype about him in fantasy football heading into the season. Obviously, the only sample size we have is the week 1 matchup against the Bears, and they're the Bears. But this Vikings defense is also very good at stopping the run. They shut down Devontae Freeman from the Falcons, who's a very talented running back. So if you have Aaron Jones, if you have somebody else who's playing a more favorable matchup, I would suggest checking that out because I think it's going to be a tough sledding for him. Also, Kenyon Drake, the Dolphins running back, he was another guy who was getting kind of hyped up heading into the season before it was made clear that Miami was just going to go into full tank mode. And he's another guy where I would start him against that I would sit him against that Patriots defense because I think they're going to shut down that running game. And also just avoid the trap of going too hard for Adrian Peterson. I know we talked about him yesterday, Joe, about him being motivated and could potentially have a big game. Just don't get too distracted by that potentially could have a good game. That Dallas rush defense is pretty good. They can shut down running backs, so I definitely think while Adrian Peterson's going to be motivated and could have a good season overall for Washington, I don't know if you have other options if you want to go with Adrian Peterson starting this week against the Cowboys.
I agree. There's plenty of good starting running backs in the league, and let alone Washington's rush offense hasn't been good, even with Adrian Peterson. So I don't expect him to have a big fantasy week. And there's just too many other good running backs that you can play that are going to put up more points than an aged veteran on a team that doesn't rush the ball fairly effectively.
Yep, most certainly. So let's quickly talk about some wide receivers you might want to keep your eyes on. Last week Deshaun Jackson made his triumphant return to the Eagles, and it looks like he's still going to continue to be that new deep threat for the Eagles. So if you have him, I don't expect him to slow down. I would expect him, especially as Carson Wentz becomes more comfortable with him. It looks like when they're going to take shots down the field, they're going to be throwing the ball to Deshaun Jackson. So if you have them, they're going up against the Eagles, who, they're going up against the Falcons, whose defense is not by any means impenetrable. I would expect him to get at least one long scoring play here in week 2, which would make him, worth starting in fantasy football. We talked about Matt Ryan already being a good guy to potentially start here against the Eagles as well at QB. So that means, if Matt Ryan's having a good game throwing the ball, some of his wide receivers are going to have a good game. Obviously, the big name there is Julio Jones, and I think Julio is a must-start anyways. But Calvin Ridley, if you do have him, I could see him scoring some touchdowns here in week 2. Again, that Eagles secondary is very porous. It's not the strong suit of their team. All of their attention is going to be towards Julio Jones, so that gives Calvin Ridley a chance to step up and potentially score a couple touchdowns there this week against Philly. Another guy to keep an eye on, and he sort of came out of nowhere and torched the Eagles. Not the Eagles. He stepped up and caught some deep balls for the Cowboys last week. Michael Gallup. Obviously, when you talk about the Eagles, the Cowboys, your big focus is on Amari Cooper, and then you have Randall Cobb in the slot. The guy that kind of gets missed in that wide receiver core is Michael Gallup, and I know my sister Mary, who's in our fantasy football league, she had him, Joe, and he scored her quite a few points. While Washington had success against Philadelphia's defense in that game, Philadelphia also had success against Washington's secondary. So I think there's certainly an opportunity for some deep balls there. So, of course, Amari Cooper is going to draw most of the attention from the Washington secondary. So look for Michael Gallup as a guy who could, again, capitalize on those deep balls that went to Deshaun Jackson last week. Look for him to have potentially a similar impact for the Cowboys here in week 2 against Washington. And then, of course, we already talked about Mike Williams. You're going to want to keep an eye on him. He certainly, even if he goes in the game, is going to be limited. He's got that knee injury. So, really, even if he does play, like I said, he's not going to be 100%. So I would consider sitting him against the Lions.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What do you think about Allen Robinson II for Chicago or Marvin Jones Jr.? Jones Jr. came on strong at the end of the game against Arizona. Allen Robinson put up points for me in week 1. He didn't get in the end zone because Chicago didn't score, but would you view these guys as perennial, competing to be that number 1 wide receiver on both of those teams?
So I think Allen Robinson is definitely the number 1 receiver for the Bears. Marvin Jones, I think he might be the wide receiver that Matt Stafford feels the most comfortable with, just because, he's been there the longest. I think with the Lions, it's a little more tricky because I think Kenny Golladay is probably going to be the number 1 wide receiver, I would imagine, in terms of production at the end of the season. But at the same time, I don't think you can undervalue the fact that Matthew Stafford feels very comfortable with him. And I think that's why you saw towards the end of that game, when Stafford was forced to make quick decisions, he felt very comfortable throwing to Marvin Jones. So, obviously there's a lot of new faces in that Lions passing attack. So, in terms of who has the more big game potential, I think Marvin Jones will probably be more consistent week to week because, again, he has that comfort level with Matt Stafford. Whereas I think Allen Robinson may be the guy who could have bigger weeks he could have the higher peaks in his season just because the Bears don't really have like he's like their number one guy just by process of there not being anyone else. Whereas Marvin Jones definitely has competition with, of course, Galladay, Danny Amendola, T.J. Hawkinson. There's plenty of weapons there in that passing game. So, yeah, a lot for the Bears too is going to come down to. I mean, we could see Mitchell Trubisky spread the ball around more. We haven't seen it so far in Week 1. But I guess if they become more comfortable in that offense, he might start slinging it around a little bit more. But it did seem like in Week 1, Allen Robinson was sort of his go-to guy. So even though they didn't have a big offensive output, he still did all right in the fantasy category. And yeah, just another thing to keep in mind is to keep an eye on Sterling Shepard. He's coming off that concussion, so he might not play here against Buffalo. And then one guy to watch out for, John Ross. Like I mentioned earlier for Cincinnati, he did have those 149 yards and 2 touchdowns. You may say, that was amazing, let me put him in. Again, as someone who's learned and been burned by Andy Dalton before, please don't overreact. Don't just go starting John Ross. It's tempting. I get it. But just if he's your best option, by all means, do what you have to do. But don't be fooled. Andy Dalton in that Bengals offense will hurt you more often than they will help you. And then taking a look just at the tight end position, obviously there's a bunch of guys who are your regular starts. If you have Travis Kelce, you're going to have him in. George Kittle for the 49ers, tearing it up. Zach Ertz for the Eagles. Those are 3 guys who, no matter really who they're playing, you're going to have them in. Some guys you might want to consider is Mark Andrews, the tight end for the Ravens. Again, he had a big first week, so it'll be interesting to see what he can do here in week 2. Vance McDonald for the Steelers could also be a guy who could. The Steelers tend to favor using the tight end at home. I don't know why they sort of abandon it when they're on the road, but he's a guy who there was a lot of hype for heading into the season, so I would look for Vance McDonald to maybe do something here in week 2 against Seattle. And of course, the Lions' T.J. Hawkinson. He came out and showed in week 1, set a record for a rookie debut at the tight end position. The Chargers are certainly a good defense, but they're not like a defense that's known for being this team that can hold tight ends in check. So I think if you have T.J. Hawkinson, like I'm fortunate enough to do, I think he's a pretty good fantasy start this week.
All right, what about this one? Who would you play, Delaney Walker or Vance McDonald?
I think I would go with Delaney Walker, and I would go with Delaney Walker just because I think if you look at sort of what the last couple of seasons, Delaney Walker has been one of those tight ends. He's not in the same category as like Travis Kelce or George Kittle or Gronk or, the guys who are like the must starts, but he's been a very consistent starter over the last couple of years. Whereas Vance McDonald has been kind of iffy. So
I was thinking when I drafted Vance McDonald, I was thinking that with the departure of Antonio Brown and, you got Juju Smith and you got what's his name, James Conner as running back, I would think that you'd want to have a go-to tight end in the system as well. I know they were fairly effective when they had Jesse James there catching the ball for them, and just makes me think that if they were able to establish McDonald as a go-to tight end, that he might be more productive consistently than the Delaney Walker random games where he plays really well.
Yeah, I think there's certainly an opportunity with the Steelers for Vance McDonald to play a pretty big role in that offense. So, like on paper, it certainly makes sense that, since there is that opportunity for him to be a part of the offense, that he would have the bigger fantasy upside. I'll just say that, again, I feel like Delaney Walker has been, over the last few seasons, obviously he does have some peaks. Like there'll be games where he does perform above his average, but even like his average game is still up there in terms of the tight end points. There's certainly some games where he has more productive games. But I think he is just overall one of those tight ends over the last few years who has been someone you look to start unless there's some other reason that you need to bench him for the week. But then some guys, and I can see my father bringing them up that you might want to not consider starting. Jimmy Graham. The Minnesota, look, I've talked about it. Minnesota's defense is very good. I think they can keep Jimmy Graham in check. Outside of that one touchdown pass he caught last week, he didn't do a whole lot. But certainly, I mean, one of the ways that fantasy players can contribute some points is catching touchdowns. So if he is going to be a red zone target for the Packers, even if he only has a couple of catches, but one of them's for a touchdown, it makes it worth it to start him. And so it becomes kind of iffy with tight ends, right? Like the big value from tight ends, if they score a touchdown, chances are they're going to outscore the other tight end on your roster if you're carrying two. But again, I don't like the Minnesota matchup. I think their defense is really tough. So I would sit Jimmy Graham. Also, he's been dealing with a finger injury. It's just a minor finger injury, but when he's going to catch the ball, certainly could be an issue there. And then my father also brought up Mr. Eric Ebron, and since those are your two tight ends, Dad, you're in a little bit of a pickle because I would also tend to sit Eric Ebron this week, just because in week 1, the Colts didn't seem like they were going to be using him as much in the offense as they did last year with Andrew Luck. Obviously Eric Ebron had a Pro Bowl year last year at the tight end position. And I think that was because the Colts made it a point of emphasis, kind of like what you would like the Steelers to do with Vance McDonald, Joe. They made Eric Ebron featured in their offense. And at least in week 1 of this season, it didn't seem like they were doing that. He had a chance to catch a touchdown pass last week. That pass was not completed, but that was pretty much his only chance of really contributing points to your fantasy team last week. So again, Dad, with you having two tight ends that I think, depending on which one catches the touchdown, is going to really determine which one adds value to their team. It's kind of a coin flip. I'm going to go with, I guess, Jimmy Graham. If out of the two of them, I would sit both of them if you have the opportunity. But in my dad's case, where those are his two tight ends, I guess I would go Jimmy Graham. He is at home. Aaron Rodgers does seem to like throwing to him in the red zone. So I would go that route. But I think both of those guys are two guys you have to watch out for fantasy this week. And yeah, I guess the last position for us to touch on here, Joe, are some defenses. Really, there's only one defense that I think is in that you must start if you have them category, and that is the Bears. They were, of course, the number one turnover defense last season, and the number one scoring defense last season. They played well against the Packers. They didn't necessarily blow up, but they did generate a lot of points. But they're going this week against Denver. So Joe Flacco and company, I think they can still be successful, and I think they're the one defense that's a must-start. Of course, the Patriots, as we mentioned, are playing Miami, so that's a good defense to take a look at. The Texans will be going up against Jacksonville, so the rookie quarterback getting his first start there, Gardner Minshew. I think J.J. Watt and company could take advantage of that. We mentioned the Ravens at Arizona, or taking on Arizona. I think playing host to Kyler Murray and company. This will be his first away game, so I think the Ravens defense could take advantage of that. Also, the Bills at the Giants might not be a bad defense to start this week. Again, we've talked about their two their two leading receivers from last week potentially might miss here week 2. Leaving just Saquon Barkley and Evan Ingram on that offense with Eli Manning. So a chance there to capitalize on a depleted offense for the Giants. And Joe, I have a couple of teams here that I think are weak starts at defense. Let me know which one of these you think, if there's any you disagree with here. But I'm thinking the Rams against New Orleans, I would stay away from. I'd stay away from the Chiefs against Oakland. Of course, they're the Chiefs' defense, so you kind of stay away from them in general.
Well, wait a minute. You think Chiefs will give up points to Oakland?
I'm saying if you have them as your defense, you should avoid starting them.
Okay, well then let me put this scenario on you. Would you feel more comfortable with Kansas City and Oakland, or Detroit playing LA?
I would, out of those two, I would probably start the Lions against the Chargers. I think for 3/4 of that game against the Cardinals, the Lions defense did a very good job of shutting them down. The Chargers, like I said, are going to struggle to take advantage of the thing the Cardinals did to take advantage of that Lions defense in the later part of that game, and that was really have sets where they had multiple wide receivers. We're talking, 4 or 5 people spread out. Mike Williams is out. Hunter Henry or Hunter Hayes. Hunter Henry is out, the tight end. So they're really depleted at their wide receiver position. Now they can spread Austin Eckler out and have him take one of those positions. But I don't think the Chargers are going to be able to capitalize on what made the Cardinals so successful towards the latter part of that game, just because they don't have the same depth and they don't have Larry Fitzgerald like the Chargers do.
It's a tough one. Their differential projected points is 27 for Kansas City, 26 for Detroit. My feeling on it is that I just think LA Chargers are going to be able to put up points and win the game against Detroit as compared to Oakland, who put up 14 points strong, but that's really all they could muster up, and they were playing fairly well. So I just don't see them putting up too many more points against Kansas City squad that, I thought Kansas City's defense would be all right in the, mid-range of the NFL, but then again, I don't know. So it's a toss-up. That's going to be a last-minute decision till Sunday.
Yeah, I think the Chiefs, the outlook on defense, let's just not blow the game and let the offense carry us to sort of victory. Let's do the best we can and just not do anything too ridiculous. So, whereas I think the Lions defense I think for the Lions to be successful this season, they need that defense to step up and be a difference maker for them. Of course, that's just what it's going to take for those teams to be successful, which doesn't necessarily translate to fantasy football production. But that's sort of my thoughts there. All right. Well, that goes over everything. I can see we do have a question on our opinion on Tyler Lockett, and if he is coming back this week for the Seahawks, potentially playing there against the Steelers. I do think that Russell Wilson will definitely like having somebody back in the slot, so I would expect Tyler Lockett to have a decent game there with the Seahawks if he's good to go. He was back at practice, like I said earlier, so there's certainly a chance that he'll be in that game. And if he's there, I would look at Russell Wilson to target him a few times there. So certainly, as long as he does play in the game, I think someone worth having in your lineup. All right, well, that will do it for today's first edition of the Fantasy Football Focus. I just want to thank everybody for stopping by and watching this show today. If you did enjoy the show, please do help the channel grow. Go ahead and hit that like button. Make sure you subscribe as well. We're working towards our 100 subscriber goal, and want to thank everybody who subscribed so far for the support, and just want to encourage anyone who hasn't done so but enjoys the videos to consider subscribing and helping us out. If you want to stay up to date with all the latest videos, you can also ring the bell as well next to the subscribe button. That'll just make sure that anytime we're going live with a new show, you're kept in the loop. We'll be back again tomorrow to go over our picks for Sunday's game. And Joe, I hadn't mentioned it I guess we did touch on it briefly, but so far we're batting 0 for 2 on Thursday Night Football picks. Well, hopefully here in week 3 we can find redemption. But we'll take a look at where we're sitting with the Pick'em's overall rankings. I don't want to brag, but somebody's up 3 games currently.
Yeah.
But we'll take a look at that and then see what who we like here heading into week 2's games. But that'll do it for us tonight. We'll catch you during the next video. Peace out.